and attempting to place pressure on them versus something else. I'm imagining what you think that something else might be, and whether or not that something else is something worth clamoring to.
So I appreciate the question. So let me begin by saying that I think there's room for a variety of different approaches and tactics. What I think is what should be a necessary aim in terms of movement work is at least a sort of shared imaginary, a shared vision. And sometimes I don't know if we don't necessarily have had time. I don't think people have had time to think about or to utilize a type of Black imagination that can birth or at least provide us with the future that we want. One needs to see the thing before you sort of build or go towards it. Now, why don't we have time? Well, because people are trying to live. They're trying not to be shot down by police. They are trying to do work in their communities as best they can. The story of a lot of the sort of unlikely activists who are doing movement work, people were not, they didn't, they woke up one day and a body was laid out in the street for 4.5 hours for some. For others, a white man was exonerated for killing a Black boy. So these are folk who weren't necessarily, I would call, professional activists, a lot of folk. And folk never really had time, one, to sort of not work, to not have the type of space to work through the traumas that can also influence the work that we do as organizers and activists, and to sit down and actually ask the question, well, what type of world, what type of Black-loving, Black-mattering world, what does it actually look like? Now, here's the thing about imagination. Imagination is also constricted by a range of apparatuses. You can be a heteronormative person and imagine a future where queerness and transness isn't a possibility. I often ask the question, who is alive in your Black future? What bodies are present? What expressions are present? Now, one needs to see the thing before they sort of build it. I want to make the argument that I don't think we've given ourselves enough time to do that work. Now, there are a range of tactics and approaches that one can take to build the type of world that we collectively imagine. Notice I said collectively. That is, we need to do that work together in communities. So I think a key is to ensuring that you're actually in conversation with people in communities. I want to build off of this notion of abolitionist and reformist politics, and I want to say that there may be space for them all. I do believe, though, that we need to know what sort of camp or where we fit along a spectrum. I don't think that it's as black and white. I do think that some folk can exist on a sort of spectrum. So if I asked you, for instance, and I do this exercise a lot, actually, I say abolitionist politic, and I want to think about abolitionism in the way that Ruthie Wilson Gilmore does, and that is to say, not just, abolition is not just about the absence of a thing, but it is about the thing that is going to be built in its absence, right? It isn't only about like amelioration, it is about an actual rebuilding of a world or a system, so that's key. So thinking there, abolitionist sort of politic is something along the lines of, I don't even see any use for ex-cop or said cop who shot down Black boy to go to jail, because I see jail or the prison industrial complex as the behemoth that's actually eating away at our communities. So justice looks like something different. Now, a reformist position may say something like, well, justice looks like this person going to jail, right? Utilizing sort of the system or applying some sort of new practices. Now, any of us can exist on a spectrum. Let me give you an example. So I think for me, for gender example, I think I'm a gender abolitionist. I'm on that some shit where it's like, just get rid of the boxes. Just get rid of the boxes. I'm not even interested in trying to reclaim a type of masculinity that is freed, or trying to reclaim even though I try to do that work too, a type of manhood that is redeemed from the poles of patriarchy. What if we just abolish that? On the same token, as a person who grew up, and this is always hard for me when thinking about the police, because in so many ways I am, as I get older and as I sort of engage political spheres and the state, I realize that inevitably the state, as we imagine it in the state that it is in, can't do the type of work necessary to save me are my people, when in fact itself has proven itself to over and over again be an anti-black apparatus. Now, having said that, I often think about my mom going back to home and the times when the cops did show up, how they intervened. And I mean, in a 10-year-old mind, they were the reasons why she was alive when my dad tried to kill her. So I'm often thinking, well, damn, what do we do? What then do we need in place if that 10-year-old girl, our boy, who is calling police like I did to get mommy protected, when my uncles didn't come, when my mom was too embarrassed to let somebody else know, like what type of protections would she need or they need in place? So I find myself varying on that spectrum, to be quite clear, depending on what the situation is. Now, what I think is happening within this movement is that we talk and use these catchphrases like justice and freedom and liberation, or a number of different things, without ever really having this hard unpacking what our politics are. So for some, I think Campaign Zero, which is a useful tool on its own right, I think will appeal to some. Maybe those who might fall along the sort of reformist spectrum in different ways, in ways that it will not for others who don't see any of those systems as they are, as actually being useful in the saving of our lives. Now, part of the issue is, well, how do you have that hard conversation? How do you make space for differences of different politics, different approaches and tactics? And part of what I want to say is that I think it goes back to the thing I started with, and that is to ask people, well, what the fuck type of world do you want to see? What type of world do you want to see? I don't want less death by hands of police. I don't want less bodies arrested. This is my vision, right? I want all, but we have to have those conversations so that we can assess the spaces where we may or may not have disagreement. And I think that is where we haven't been as, we haven't done that work.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Brother Darnell. Which leads me to, so your involvement in both Black Lives. So another distinction that we have made, one that's probably somewhat less useful, but I think still necessary nonetheless, is a distinction between Black Lives Matter as an organization with its genesis in 2013, and also the kind of the working title of a movement in progress, versus the movement for Black Lives, which in some ways stretches back to the first slave screaming in the bowels of the transatlantic slave trade and the slave ship. And so you, as someone who's actually been a part of what I would call the movement for Black Lives, as well as being involved very specifically in Black Lives Matter, the organization, what distinction would you draw in terms of, so for instance, what is Black Lives Matter's position on XYZ? Or is that question in and of itself kind of a misnomer or problematic, I would think?
I think that's a useful question. I always make a distinction between the two. So, I think you're right in saying, I always say that this is an iteration or a bump in a long history of Black struggle. I try not to sort of, I want to look at a long history of movement building, like you said, ever since we arrived. The movement for Black Lives, I think, is a very useful way to talk about the moment. One, because it doesn't privilege one organizational body or one collective over another, when in fact there are so many collectives that have been doing work in the last few years and for a long time before that. So that distinction is very, very important, and I think it actually does the work of visibilizing and bringing to the fore all of these bodies, and we should name them. I mean, there's so many. Not just the big names like Dream Defenders and BYP 100. I mean, there's legacy organizations like NAACP, if we want to count that. That was a minor bit of shade. Necessary. And so many others, right? Like SCLC. I mean, we can list all of these big organizations, but then there are organizations that have been built, Southerners on the Ground, Wow. I mean, Organization for Black Struggle in St. Louis. That often the sort of efforts that they have committed and their labor tends to be invisibilized, tends to get lost in the narrative, and we cannot allow that to happen. So we talk about Kimberly Crenshaw. How many of you heard the hashtag Say Her Name? Right? Well, like that was from the African American Policy Forum, right? Like we can't neglect all of these bodies. So it's important to ensure that we include in our sort of narrative a range of folk that have been doing this work. BLM specifically is a network that started, you already know the story, in 2013. My involvement in that came with Ferguson. So from 2013 to about 2014, they had been doing, it was a social media intervention. It was a burgeoning sort of political platform, a sort of a philosophy, if you will, a mantra that was developing. And I mean, there have been small actions that have been committed in places like LA under the Black Lives Matters sort of theme. I mean, there was a social media presence. In Ferguson, what was really amazing about the work, so Patrice and I organized a sort of freedom ride of sorts to Ferguson that took about 500 people from across the country. And with us were a range of different people. But even that, like if we were in Ferguson, it was because of the work of those on the ground in Ferguson already, right? So Organization for Black Struggle, Missourians, MORE is the sort of acronym, and I don't know what they stand for, and I should. And all of these activists were already on the ground doing work. We just went there and asked, how can we be of assistance? That ride resulted in people going back to their communities. And our goal wasn't just say to go and just drop into Ferguson and let's be superhumans for Ferguson. Like we could bring some shit that they don't already have. The goal was to investigate the extent to which Ferguson was Bed-Stuy, was Camden, was Trenton, was America. And to take and to really inspire people to go back and do their work. In terms of BLM, what BLM stands for, I think it is okay to ask that question, partially because BLM is organized of chapters across the country. We speak to one another. We're in conversation. Those chapters are in conversation every day. We actually have a BLM NYC chapter that I'm part of. Like, we are talking, they're probably talking right now, online. I mean, they're meeting every week. Folk are actually in conversation. And I guess I can say a bit about the way in which we want to approach how we are attempting to approach developing a platform. And that is a slow sort of approach. You know how many times you can drop a sort of quote-unquote black agenda out of the sky and say, this is what black people want? You can't do that really if you don't take time speaking to black people. And our goal really is to have networks wherever they're located to knock on people's doors in the spaces that they live and say, what is actually the issues in your community? What are the issues in your community? We'll have some bucket areas, but it's important to vet and be in conversation with the people you say you're organizing on behalf of so that you can have buy-in. And, so I get talk, I had a New York Times, well, and I said, you want me to give you a piece of paper with some talking points on it, with some policies. I'm telling you that, like, organizing, first of all, organizing is not new. Just isn't. I know y'all know that, but I just want to reiterate. Like, organizing the way that I'm imagining it is like the organizing that allows cities like Chicago to push back against redlining, to stop mortgage, to keep all types of manner of issues. You know what organizers would do? They would actually move into communities. And far before they started walking around and protesting and doing actions, they lived amongst the people, so you know what they wanted to know first? Their names. Their kids' names, if they had food in their house. They built relationships so that they can then be trusted. And I want to say, like, this is why I push back against folk that says, oh, the president's just running, like, give us some shit. No. You hold up, you wait. You wait. And give people an opportunity to do the type of organizing that you can have buy-in from folk across the country. And not only buy-in, which is to say that you have some inactive participant who's going to listen to you spew some analysis that you think they don't have, but you ask folk, what the specific issues are in our communities, and that's part of where BLM is now. As my chair, that's part of where BLM is, and if BLM comes out with a platform or sort of framework, it is fair to say that that is something that BLM as a network came up with, and that shouldn't be held as a framework that anybody else has to necessarily buy into.
Now, what are the challenges you see just in terms of New York? New York is a really interesting place to do organizing work because in some ways you would think that it's oversaturated, but in fact I have found that it's actually there's such a void in terms of there's Justice League, there's BLM, but there's, to me at least, there seems to be somewhat. Did you shrink? You want
to know what? It's the state that is. The state is got me chairs. You know, people blame the state.
But are there, or is that one lower?
This is perfect.
Okay. Are there differences? Essentially, the core of my question is: are there differences between New York City's the challenges facing New Yorkers? Black New Yorkers versus, obviously, the challenges facing those in, whether we're talking about Cleveland, whether we're talking about Ferguson, whether we're talking about Detroit. Are there different challenges in terms of how we do the organizing work in this city for Black New Yorkers?
Yeah, for
Black organizers.
And, to keep it real, it's very, very hard to... So there's a lot to be considered. I think there is a need to be mindful of the folk that have been on the ground doing work for some time. It's like people didn't just wake up over the last year to do police brutality work. And it's easy, when in the sort of heat of these moments, without any type of institutional knowledge or knowledge of a particular space and place, and for many of us, it's like reactionary type of activist work we do. It's easy to forget. We feel like we created this shit. We marching and with new banners and new slogans, and you're walking around as if people hadn't been doing this work already, when in fact they have for a long, long time. So part of the work is the hard work is actually there is a way. I'll say this. We have to be sure that we do not do to each other what the system does to us. And I think that that's a key mantra that I sort of live by. And that is to say, if the system, and by system I mean sort of a neoliberal system, which is all about the individual. It is all about the notions of sort of competition, expertise, the sort of good being commodified. It is so easy to do the same type of work within organizing practices. Before you know it, we're branding ourselves. We're beholden to brands that sort of brand narratives that block us in, and then it becomes competition. And instead of fighting a system, you're fighting each other.
That's right.
And we're not even talking about the personal issues. I can't tell you how many times I'll look at something like a TV show and how y'all up here talking about you fighting for Black lives, and you want to save Black lives, or you want to save women, or you want to save queer folk, and you can't talk to each other after you leave that show. You ain't never getting free that way. So dealing with part of my thing has been I don't want to do another. Don't send me to a retreat. I don't want to do any fucking brainstorm, brain dump, strategy session unless y'all ready to get healed.
Yeah.
And that's how I am. That's where I am now. Ain't no way you think you are going to change and transform a system that is entrenched if you become an expert at practicing the same tactics. How dare you? You can't look at me. You can't say hi. We can't be collegial. We both Black, but you telling me you standing for justice? That ain't gonna work. So this is a type of infectious shit that works itself out that you don't see. You think everything looks pretty, and it's not. But here's the thing: this is not new. Our movements have always been infected by this type of thing, right? It's a reason why you don't know people's names like Diane Nash. you know, they had a lot to say about Bayard Rustin, right?
No, that's so crucially important. I actually want to take this moment just to do a quick just in terms of pedagogy here, because I mean Darnell's point is just so important, and it links back to really everything you've been reading thus far. In terms of we talked about, so one of the things we talk about all semester is these leftist buzzwords that folks throw around without actually having much reader clarification. So one of them, what was the first one we talked about? Well, race being the first one. People talk about race as a social construction without having any idea what that actually looks like. People talk about it in terms of intersectionality. I was going to do some stuff on that. We'll save that for another week. Another phrase that's crucially important that you understand with clarity is neoliberalism, and what neoliberalism actually is. And just really quickly, and so how does Dr. West talk about neoliberalism? Because Dr. West actually, Cornell talks about neoliberalism with a particular phrase, which you should know because you read Democracy Matters. What are the three dogmas? It's one of the three dogmas he argues is crushing the energy out of the American Democratic Project. It's 35, y'all. I got to do better than this.
Aggressive militarism.
Aggressive militarism. Thank you.
Individualism?
Okay, see, I got to go back and read that, right? So, aggressive militarism, escalating authoritarianism, and free market fundamentalism. So, neoliberalism, which Brother Darnell did such a wonderful job of talking about how it affects the activist movement. Neoliberalism, the kind of textbook definition would be that neoliberalism is really a theory of governance, economic theory primarily, that privileges the free market. And so the certain tenets of neoliberalism become, well, as Darnell mentioned, expertise. Can't spell today. I got that. The market itself, or marketability. Competition. And privatization, really. So you look at that and you say, okay, so what does that actually mean? Well, two examples really quickly. One example would be, for instance, Obama's healthcare plan, right? The Affordable Care Act. Why that's such a terrible piece of legislation, right? It's not a terrible piece of legislation for why the right wants you to believe that it's the big government taking over. It's actually neoliberalism at its core, right? The Affordable Care Act is a form of neoliberal economic policies par excellence, in the sense that, what is the Affordable Care Act? The Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, contrary to popular sort of right-wing belief, is not an actual new system. It's not like Medicaid, where you're actually, I can sign up for a particular government system. What it is it's an exchange. So that's another tenet of neoliberalism. Exchange, right? What Obama's healthcare is, it's a private exchange, right? Which says that citizens are not citizens anymore, they're consumers, which is another sort of, we can just do this forever. This is another tenet of neoliberalism, consumerism. And what Obamacare does is it says all U.S. citizens will now be required to have health care, right? That it's now law that you must actually have health insurance or you will be fined. But here's the catch-22. Who remembers what the debate was about? There was something that people were trying to get.
Single
Payer, and there was one other thing. Single payer is way to the left. There was one other thing that was kind of middle ground.
A public option?
The public option, right? So what that meant was this, so the public option didn't happen, right, as a result of Obama caving into the insurance industry. What the Affordable Care Act did was it says that all citizens, all American citizens, consumers, have to go to this private market where you have to now buy private insurance without a public option. So what is the problem with that? Who can already see the kind of flaw in this piece of policy? Yeah.
You get more Johnsons and Johnsons.
Well, you get more. And what does that mean?
You get just more rich companies.
You give it tremendous amount of power to the free market, right? So what it does is it actually turns all Americans. It turns health care into a consumer system, right? Where you're saying, how do you now make health care a federal mandate without a public option? Because what that means is if there is no longer a public option, but only an unregulated free market. Remember, this private insurance market is unregulated. And one of the key, and I should say this, and I'm going to get right back to this discussion. The key tenet of neoliberalism is unregulated markets, right? So here's where I'm going with this. You put everyone into a private market. You don't regulate this market. what happens? Insurance companies have no incentive to actually charge affordable rates.
Right.
So because this market is unregulated without a public option would say we're going to make insurance $500 a month. Because if you make insurance $500 a month, then you know that American citizens and consumers are going to go for the public option because that's cheaper, because that will keep the private insurers from raising their rates. Without a public option, you have neoliberalism par excellence, where you now have an unregulated free market where there are no federal laws to prohibit how much insurance companies will actually charge for their insurance plans, but it now becomes federal law that you have to actually enter this market. It was a long-winded kind of way of describing neoliberalism. Do people kind of get it now a little bit easier? Another idea to think about it would be New York City rental rates, right? The fact that New York City is the most egregious neoliberal market in America, right? The fact that we have a system where you can charge $3,500 a month to live in a box is actually as a result of neoliberal policies. The idea of the free market. Why is this important? Because when we talk about what freedom means, freedom cannot simply mean the free market. And freedom is often reduced in the neoliberal imagination. Freedom is reduced to the right to spend or the right to buy. The free market becomes freedom.
Sounds like enlightenment.
And so, and so that, you just want to think about that. And so what Darnell is saying that's so important is that even activism itself gets reduced to a market where, again, people start measuring influence by Twitter followers, about how marketable they are. Even when you heard, part of my exchange with DeRay was about DeRay's position is essentially that police brutality is the issue that he focuses on because that's the more marketable issue. I mean, he almost explicitly says that. He says, well, that's what got people out into the streets, so that's what we're going to focus on. One might argue that in some ways it really acquiesces to the logic of neoliberalism and this idea of marketability in really deep, in deeply problematic ways. Do you want to think about that?
That was good.
So I know that other folks have questions, and I have a whole bunch, but including questions that you guys have all pre-prepared. But I'd like to hear from you directly. So who has a question that they'd like? Yes.
Okay, that's fine.
Yes.
So we were discussing a little earlier.
And say your name.
My name is Sophia. We were discussing a little earlier the connection of Black Lives Matter with the presidential campaign or lack thereof. And my question is, what are the potential consequences of Black Lives Matter not attaching to a political candidate? In that, if the followers of Black Lives Matter don't vote for any political candidate, and if there's a lesser of two evils in this situation, if the less preferable candidate is elected into office and that person is allowed power that could further harm the progress of the Black Lives Matter movement, what are the consequences of that attachment?
Big questions.
Yes. So, a couple thoughts. So the movement for Black Lives, again, I want to make a distinction, is made up of a range of different bodies and collectives. BLM as a network has made a decision not to endorse a candidate, which I think is a wonderful idea. Partially because so I've had conversations, for example, with presidential contenders, just one for now. And I think it's actually a bit premature I actually don't think it's a good idea at all for a network to back a candidate, particularly if you listen to what I said before about how we envision our future, right? Like, there are some folk who think the state can save us, and there are some folk who just like, I don't think the state at all can. Well, what do I mean by that? I'm in the room with some folk who are going to vote in the next election, and there are people who are just not going to, because they are sort of abolitionists in a sense that they are imagining a different way of being in the world. But to the politics of it all, my sense is that it becomes it's a sort of speaking of neoliberalism, I think it's been a smart move for Democratic candidates to sort of say things like Black Lives Matter. But I don't think that anyone have come up with the type of policies that actually. Is it?
It was now when I messed it up.
Oh my gosh, more video.
Because this one's not working. I
No,
wanna
it
make
is
sure-
working.
Oh, it
it's
is working?
going.
Even though it's on
Even
black?
though
Yeah.
what? Even when it's black, it's going.
Okay.
The camera's still working.
It's me being
So yeah. I actually.
and anything that you don't actually want.
Oh, that's all. I just, I honestly, now I'm gonna tell you a story after I say this. I honestly don't think it's a good idea to just to support someone willy nilly. One, because saying BLM has become a sort of a currency for political
Cultural
candidates that says, I hear you, but unless you are actually producing policy and have a record that substantiates that Black lives matter to you in terms of policy, why the hell should we be endorsing you? I just don't see and I'm speaking for myself as a member of a larger network, but I stand by this network and saying, no, you got to work to gain the trust of a potential voter base. You just don't get the sort of BLM approval sticker to put on your platform, which becomes another brand, so that you can go out there and say that Black people are kicking it with you like that, or you got the Black vote. How many? So I can go on. Let me another story then about why I wrestle in terms of my placement in the state, my complicity with state practices, and at the same time, my resistance to even seeing the state as an actual option to save us. So you mentioned Obama. Thank you. And Obama might seem, for many, was the sort of panacea for all things racial injustice and other problems. I mean, he was like, I don't know, like Obama guy, he was like, yes, shit, America about to be the best thing, and as you know, no. Well, one specific example. I was shocked when, well, I won't say that. What I will say is, how many of you heard of the My Brother's Keeper initiative? Okay, so if you didn't, it's Obama's sort of signature, and what is supposed to be like a racial justice initiative. I don't know if they use that language explicitly, though they talk about its impacts on Black and brown boys. Part of the work that I was part of was pulled together by Kimberly Crenshaw and some others. Kimberly Crenshaw from AAPF, folk from Miss Foundation like Lakeisha Lewis, Brittany Cooper. There's a long list of folk who tried to work with the administration and push the administration to include girls. This is just a simple example. Because the point was, like, if the house is on fire, let's call America the house. Why the hell are you just going to get some of the people out of it? Their thoughts was, well, we need to get the boys saved first. Hear the logic, patriarchal, so that they can go and be good dads and workers. And then once they get their shit together, because this is what Moynihan had said too, right? When you get the Black man together, your communities will be good. Well, that's all fucked up. And our point was, how are you going to go out of your presidency on the heels of what's supposed to be a racial justice initiative and keep Black girls out, and Black and brown girls out of this, when they are in fact impacted by police brutality? When in fact, right under physical assault by police, you know what the second form of misconduct is? Sexual misconduct. When in fact, Black girls not only, at sort of the whims of the state, but Black women and girls are disproportionately impacted by rape and sexual assault and other forms of assault, mostly by people in their communities. So our point, when Black girls are the highest group to be expelled and detained in schools, we went on and on to try to convince them of this, and they pushed back. There were meetings, and they said no. No. And got mad publicly and had all types of counter narratives being produced in the media. I'm using this example to say if we hold up Obama then as, let's say, that person that we're going to put all of our sort of support behind, willy-nilly, without any form of accountability, without pressing to see what their politics are on a range of issues. And when we say Black Lives Matter, we mean all. So I'm not just talking about police brutality. I'm talking about the reality that trans Black women are being killed. Ain't nobody marching for them. I'm talking about an economic system that even if I wasn't shot down by police, will still have Black people the most poor. So it isn't enough for me, and I think for any of my comrades, to say, if as long as you get up here and talk about, I don't know, the need for fucking police cameras on vests, that you're doing some good for Black folk. Not when your record, Clinton, has been such that the reason why we have a behemoth of a prison system with laws that arrested my cousins, your cousins, most of our family members for weed when people were walking around here selling. Not when your jails are built on a no. So I want to say that there is a need. I totally am thankful for the need to not rush into a sort of dangerous relationship with people who haven't done their work, their analysis, the policy, the type of policy work, and the building with our communities, sitting down and being held accountable. So notice the types of folk that they won't talk to, and notice the folk that they will. And then you tell me why we shouldn't or should be backing people right away.
I feel like Akira is overrepresented generally in questions. So I'm gonna as wonderful as I'm sure it is, I'm going to first get to Jordan and Shelly. And then Akira. Okay?
Hi. And talking about intersectionality, I'm curious how both the movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter deals with the specific issues that affect queer people like HIV and AIDS. So we haven't really talked about that as much yet.
Trying to get you ready to talk about it.
Yeah, so a lot of the time we talk about like very specific action, and with HIV/AIDS policy it tends to be a lack of action that lets people, disproportionately trans people of color and queer people of color, die. And I'm just curious about, like, in your work with LGBT communities, which you brought up that you were doing, like if that comes up, like dealing with HIV.
Yeah, and a really quick response. One of the things that that I was happy to be part of was some minor conversations when the movement for Black Lives Convening was brought up to include sessions on the criminalization of HIV. And in fact, that conversation has begun, and a lot of the sort of movement builders across the country, and it's not. And let me be fair to say that not enough has been done. So, in actually St. Louis, not too far from where Michael Brown was shot, Michael Johnson, who I visited in jail, is a young brother who is HIV positive, who is now going to spend 30 years in jail on charges of the dangerous use of HIV. And no one was rallying, like no one was sort of talking about that. But there is some work being done now. One, because I think that folk still need education, believe it or not, in 2015 around not only the disease itself and its impacts, and still I think there is some sort of a cloak of silence and shame that some communities are still working through, activists too. And then third, there is so little, people have a lack of information, as in people don't know that there are actually laws that criminalize literally sex, HIV, and so many other things, and they're different from state to state. And that type of capacity enhancement work, I want to call it, like the need to sort of to build up the sort of knowledges for folk it's been happening. Folk have been doing this work forever, and I think it's also now being seen as a need within this sort of larger movement for Black lives.
When we talk about that gap, I mean, again, you know, the work, and this is work that Darnell's been doing for years. When you think about organizations like People of Color in Crisis, now defunct, Gay Men of African Descent, GMAD, on the verge of going under. These organizations focusing on the issue, the question you're really talking about is HIV prevention and intervention in communities of color, particularly in Black queer communities.
Mm-hmm.
There have always been folks doing that work, like Darnell says, but you don't know those names, and it's so much easier to celebrate Dream Defenders, which is amazing, Black Lives Matter, which is amazing, but we forget about those folks who belong to a different movement for Black lives, long before it was hashtagable, and who still even today, what does it mean that today, right, GMAD, Gay Men of African Descent, right? We know that Black gay men in New York City are the highest, have the highest HIV rates. HIV rates that actually rival Sub-Saharan Africa. And the one organization committed to that type of activist work is on the brink of extinction. So when we talk about Black Lives Matter, again, it talks about which Black lives are worth saving and which Black lives matter to the state as well as to the communities that are actually doing the rallying cry, right? And are we using, when we say Black Lives Matter, are we actually attending to the communities who are responsible for the creation of the phrase, or are we simply reappropriating that hashtag for our own heterosexist purposes? That's really the question that kind of one of the questions that ghosted over the movement for me. But I wanted to get to Shelley.
Yeah. So kind of piggybacking off of that then, I had a question about, basically, there are these narratives that I think become well known, through the media, through social media, or through big media like broadcast news. Like, for example, the connection of this hashtag Black Lives Matter with police brutality against cis Black men. Or, be it, I think in general, we've seen a lot of ways in which the movement for Black lives, the larger movement for Black lives, has been sort of sifted down into narratives that don't actually represent the work that's being done on the ground by the media, sort of like what you were just saying, like, why is it that we don't know about organizations like GMAD? And so my question was, media, I think, has a powerful role in an ability to spread visibility in a certain way, especially in our current age where we can create decentralized media in a way with the internet. But I guess my question was, how do we control the narrative in the media such that we can give visibility to those who have not had it, such that we can, spotlight organizations like those, such that we make sure that the media is not writing our narrative for us. They're not rewriting what it is that we're about. They're not rewriting it, who it is founded it. How do we take control of that? And is it possible to do it through the media? Is it something we shouldn't even attempt to do? Should we perhaps attempt to do it through social media, through decentralized means like that? I guess I was curious about what you would say to that.
Yep, I work in media, and I will say that we can't rely on media to do that work. Partially because media are interested in the production of certain narratives. I work in media, and I can probably name, I can just scroll through my head right now and name, Black writers I know who are allowed, platforms across the country. So it's not that many of us. And many of us are working within white media companies. Which is not to say that I don't think some of these companies have concern about what's being told, but I will say that when you look, the way that the stories are going to be told will always reflect the people that's actually running these companies and where money is coming from. All that to say, though, I do think we have responsibility as activated citizens. And what I am so thankful for Ferguson protesters and for people like DeRay and Netta and Ashley, I can list a lot of folks' names, is the use of these democratized, if we can call them that. That's a question that we should ask ourselves. Sort of media spaces, mediating spaces, to tell our stories on our own terms. That also has its problems that I can probably talk about too. But I often say though that history is never really kind to us. You know, I actually am watching, you know, as a person who is involved in a thing that I get to write about, it becomes kind of hard. But you can see how I now see how people's narratives and how victories and how fights have been left. I could see how this shit was left out of like civil rights movement history as I'm in it. Because I look and I'm going, what? That's not how that shit go. But that's the narrative that gets sold. And it's the narrative that feels good. And it's the narrative that's marketed. And people love it. And then we repeat it. And it becomes a type of truth. And meanwhile, you're like, so many people have been invisibilized. So many sort of stories, so many layers. But it's our response. Now, the nice thing is we do have like the option to sort of do the type of work in whatever way that you think you want to do that. I see Facebook as a type of archive. I see Twitter and Tumblr, blogs, and a range of spaces as mediating spaces. And I think that we should use those.
And two, let me just, another quick little jump in, but this one will be shorter than this one. The reason why your question, than this one was. The reason why your question is important, though, Shelley, is that it has to do with really how we understand movements. Another term, the professor in me has to do this, like, reader clarification thing. Like, if people talk about movements and black social movements, and don't really know what that is, right, and how those are made up. But oftentimes, at least I would argue, black freedom movements since the 19th century have always been made, when we talk about what a movement is, that movement always consists of at least the following four players. Thinkers. Now, I say this already from the onset to say that these are not mutually exclusive categories, and that there is often very important informative overlap. But you usually have thinkers, organizers, informants, spiritual leaders, and then I would say policymakers. This is extremely reductive. Like the academic community, if I were to ever publish this, I could see myself like critiquing this and talking about why this is wrong. But for the purposes of teaching, all movements, black social movements, tend to have these 5 players at work. But part of the problem is some folks don't really know what they're best at. And when I say that, and I don't say this as I say this, well, let me just come out and say this. I say this when I think about, for instance, I'm trying to be careful, right? When I think about some players within the movement for Black Lives, it seems to me that they are actually best as informants. That one of the reasons that Black Lives Matter, that Ferguson happened, was because you had people on the ground using Twitter as informants. I don't mean informants in the kind of FBI, that term is itself problematic, right? But informants as in, this is what's happening, here's what's happening on the ground. One of the reasons that Ferguson became what it became was because you actually had people on the ground who were willing to create a new narrative, a narrative that was not being reported in corporate media. So folks like McKesson, Janetta, et cetera, were on the ground actually informing the public what was going on. All informants are not best as policymakers. And so when an informant, someone who's actually best documenting what is happening, then steps into a role of, I'm going to come up with a comprehensive list of points, this, that, and the other, you see that sometimes folks are not as good doing one thing to the other. Do people kind of get what I'm saying? And again, that all these categories are very, very, Audrey was all of these things. Malcolm was all of these things. Martin was all of these things. Fannie Lou was all of these things. So they're in and of themselves not mutually exclusive, but sometimes folks are better as informants than they are as the other things, and they don't really know it. I say that to say that. Wait, first Akira, then Siobhan.
I think I'll pass it to Siobhan.
Okay.
I feel like I'm sharing space.
So you talked about more backing politicians on a larger scale earlier, such as presidential candidates. Although it's like evident that you could be a fighter and activist without being in politics or anything of that sort. For the individuals that want to get into politics on like a smaller scale, such as like Congress, per se, in what way do they go about creating policies for the community, the Black community, while still staying or worrying about staying elected in that position, so they could keep making policies when the rate or the most voters that vote are like white middle class individuals, and the high incarceration of Black individuals permits them not to like vote, or they can't vote after they get out of it.
So before Darnell even answers, you see how neoliberalism is embodied in that, is ingrained in that question though? The minute you talk about being worried about being elected, you're talking market language, you're talking about competition, right?
Yeah, okay. One point that I'll say is that, and in fact, I'm thankful for this question because it's making me think about some others. I actually think for many of our communities, the folk and the politicians, if we are going to worry about them, it should be our local politicians. And a lot of we spend so much attention on like presidents without thinking about the folk that we vote in are not, because the voter turnout for like council people in this city is very low. When in fact the sort of day-to-day type of aggressions, material ones, tend to come from actions that are actually put in place by our local politicians.
Mm-hmm.
So I walk out onto a street corner and one day a random ass city bike. I'm like, why is there a city bike? What do you call that? The rack. On my, it just came out of nowhere. It just like a guy just dropped it from the sky onto my corner. The president got, well, we can make this argument. My point is, I'm sitting, I was so mad, and everybody on my block was so mad because nobody talked to us. We were not asked if we wanted city bikes on our corner. In fact, the corner where the bikes are is where livery taxis would park in the morning so that elderly people on the block or people who did not have the capacity to walk to the A train from where I live could just get in the car and go to work or to the doctors. Those cars are no longer able to park there. Anyway, that's a minor type of issue that can be taken up by a council person. The fact that I go to my corner and just all of a sudden there are like 7 cops, 5 of them are white, like on my corner being aggressive with me, is a municipal problem. So I'm just not necessarily sure that this goes back to what our vision is, what we want our communities to look like, which may or may not begin with the president. It may begin with my council person. So I do think that there is and this is from someone, I have dabbled in politics and thought about running, but I said I can't do it because I can't lie. And I'm not, so if y'all, any politicians in the room, please don't run. By all means, I have people that can help you. But I, and this could be my old cynicism, my age and just my cynicism. I did work in Newark, worked with politicians there. And part of what I discovered is that, like, as a politician, that is, you're a politician, there's not so much you can really do. Well, you can. But much of our sort of political sphere is so impacted by it's no longer there. But the sort of neoliberal sphere that we brought up is so impacted. I mean, now, your policies are often shaped by the folk that are giving you money.
That's right. Which goes back to that point before you came, Darnell. What's your name again? I'm sorry?
Alex, but
Alex?
also you
Who
brought
raised the point about oligarchy?
Oh, it was me. Sorry.
Or it was Elizabeth?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Raised about this study that Princeton came out with a couple of years ago, that the U.S. in practice is essentially not a democracy; it's an oligarchy. Which is what Darnell is describing. When part of the reason why politics are in and of themselves, so many folks just say "fuck the system," has to do with the fact that the system is already the parameters for how we envision the kind of the framework for freedom have already been really tightly set.
I mean, yes. So when you think specifically about Black politicians who are being vetted and loved on by folk who are interested in the privatization of schools, so like the Walton family. I mean, there's a bunch of foundations that will throw money at folks' way. And you wonder, like, why the sort of insistence, particularly within urban black spaces, towards charter schools, which public charter schools and school options, it's because, the fruit is being dangled by folk like the Walton Group. I mean, all that just like, if we're not aware of the reality that the sort of political sphere as we come to understand it is so shaped by a free market, neoliberal sphere. This is why I guess I'm not convinced that with the state of our present political system, I am not convinced that it can do the type of work necessary to make America less sick. I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced. I mean, if y'all look at the numbers and which groups are given to whom so that their agendas can be forwarded, you would be shocked.
Absolutely.
And you would be shocked when you look at who takes the money. Well, maybe not.
Right here in New York, just last week on 125th Street, saw Assemblyman, what is this guy, Keith Wright, who's one of the major Congressional Black Caucus darlings, signed into or was responsible for the legislation that increased police presence on 125th Street and Lexington Avenue by, I think it's like 600 police officers. Why on earth's name, in this particular moment, would the police have the kind of capital to actually increase their presence in communities of color? Well, it had to do with a lot of these issues that Darnell were talking. Some of it's about sleepwalking, folks not knowing what's going on, but it was a local issue because residents were concerned about there being a homeless population on 125th and Lexington. So instead of actually creating shelters, creating opportunities for homeless people to actually not be homeless, we instead put more cops. So we put police to actually to police a problem that has nothing to do with the police. Right? Why are police officers being used as the solution for a problem that's about homelessness and lack of housing? So deep.
And just another example. So you all know that New York has a really bad stop and frisk.
Yeah.
Stop, question, and frisk. You all know that. You know that black and brown folk are disproportionately stopped. You all know this, and most of them are innocent. You know that. You know Bloomberg was supportive of this. Yes.
Right.
You know what foundation gave money to Obama to do the My Brother's Keeper initiative? Bloomberg's foundation. Do you not see the contradictory nature of that? I won't even tell you because I know you all are smart enough to make this connection. But these are the types of connections we should be thinking through. How, Bloomberg, is it possible for you to send this money to so it's a federal initiative that's bringing together philanthropy.
That's the other piece of it. But it's actually not policy.
It's not public.
Yeah, it's philanthropy.
But part of that money. Okay, so I'm gonna leave y'all with that. Right
Mm-hmm.
now, I don't want to be too Let me offer you a bit of hope then, and say that I do think that there is a way that one can be involved in a political system and make change. I don't think that it happens without cost. I don't think that it happens without the sort of sometimes demoralizing of one's character and being. There are costs to be paid to do political work. And I have friends who I support who are politicians who I know they have to make some rough decisions that actually has some how do you begin to sort of count losses and wins in that? I don't know. But I think it takes fortitude and a willingness to be unpopular amongst those with power to do it right. And that still, by virtue of the position, will not exonerate or free you from having to deal with all that it brings. But I want to believe that it is possible. I want to believe that someone with a heart for the people Obama was an organizer. And you see what can happen. He's also in a very precarious, I didn't expect him to be able to do so much, not when you're president of the United States. Just because by virtue of the position that one is in. So there are some costs to be paid, I think. But I don't want to stop anyone from doing it. Right.
Okay, so it's already 9 o'clock, 2 seconds. So we're going to take 2 questions. Who haven't I heard from? Timothy, have I heard from you? Wait. Okay, yeah, go ahead, Timothy.
Okay. My question's more about organizing. So you guys were just talking about the no new NYPD thing, and like I do organizing in the city, and I remember going to like a couple meetings about that, and there was just no support for it, and it was so important. Like it was 1,300 new cops or something like that. So like, I guess it's so easy for me to get discouraged because the organizing always seems to be around who died yesterday. But like these things are so important. So like, how do you think that we can make it more about these issues and like the underlying causes?
It's a very, very good question. I think that, so let's be clear that when we're talking about organizing, I want to make a distinction between sort of organizing our actions that may occur in response to sort of mass mediated moment, like a killing, right? And often, like, the type of reaction to those are often short-lived, and I don't want to call that organizing. I want to say that those are sort of like responses, actions, and I want to think about organizing as sort of sustained movement work over time, relationship building, policy analysis. I mean, it could consist of a range of things. I don't even want to define it in that way, but I think, just to your point, to get to the sort of type of changes you want to see, we have to actually be committed to organizing. And that takes time, and it takes effort. And it actually doesn't take the sort of masses that one sees at a protest to make it happen. But to say that, to encourage you, the work, the campaign that you're referencing took work. I mean, it was the result of people doing work over a substantial amount of time, and I want to count that as a win. Now, I think they went against more than just politicians in attempting to get that, attempting to get the mayor to sort of push against hiring 1,300 police. You have to remember, you're also, with in this moment of sort of increased militarization of police, you're not only going against police, but you're going against police unions, you're going against all the companies that are wanting to sell them new cameras on their lapels, you're going against, it really is a monster. But the imprint that was made was felt. And that is a win. I think we need to be more intentional, not see these sort of reactive responses, protests, as organizing. And see them as responses that we need, but I want to say organizing is something different.
And also, just really quickly, and that piece of this actually goes back to thinking. Thinkers, just the clarification when I said thinkers. Thinkers just doesn't mean people who sit in the academy and just write books. That all freedom movements begin with ideas, right? So ideas are important. So the idea that we actually should not have more police, that our safety is not predicated on the presence of the police, actually really first usually comes from thinkers, right? Folks who say, you know what, how about we try this idea? Because clearly these are the policy that we currently have that is not working for us. So even organizing, we see how it's linked to, for instance, in this case, this realm of thinking. And so what you're doing, I say all that to say, the type of work you're doing here, that all of you are doing here, you can bring back to the various communities that you are involved in and doing organizing work with, to actually share some of the ideas that were incubated in the context of the classroom, right? Well, think about that. One more question. Here. Okay, was there one over here?
I want to hear it.
You want to start? You want to? Go ahead.
Okay. Since you said that, I think my question is dawning on imagination. So for me,
Awesome.
I'm like a writer who's involved in like visionary futurism, and I think imagining the future is a way of liberation, is a way of like us sitting down and radically thinking about how we are free. And I think not a lot of people who are marginalized have the chance to do that. Like, we could sit here all day and talk about how the white man is keeping us down without realizing how we can like fight and work towards a future where we are not perpetuating these like white racist frameworks. So I guess my question is, even if you're in a community and you're seeing people who have not yet done the work, are they still allowed to imagine? Are they still allowed to imagine being liberated, even though someone who is like intersectional in all the conversations that are taking place, know about the queer issues, know about the trans issues, saying, well, your liberation still got like imperialism, all this little mumbo jumbo in there. So I guess in that way, it's just like, do we have to patrol how we view our Black future, and like how can we like sit down and like imagine our Black future, knowing that it's laced with various like phrases and points of like our versions of liberation.
That's so wonderful. I've been writing a lot on, and I want to cite Robin D.G. Kelly here's Black Freedom Dreams.
It almost made it onto the syllabus. You see, we're doing too much. Couldn't do it.
And a Black radical imagination as catapulting my thinking in this. And what I've built, like the thing that I have taken away from the questions I've asked after reading Kelly's work is, yes, we ought to sort of give space for Black radical imagination, but it occurred to me that I referenced this, that our imaginations can be sort of incarcerated, that they can be caged in by all these ideas that we are taught about who we are as bodies, as sexual, as beings who have been gendered, who have been raced, who are situated within all of these class dynamics. That is to say, even our imaginations must also be decolonized. Our imaginations must also maroon and break free. Because you can dream a world, a future, that bodies forth the same energy and rigid restrictions and binaries and curses that exist in the first. It's like new wine and old wineskins. That's a sort of riff off of the biblical text. So my question has been now, well, what does it take not only to dream a new world, a new future, and to use the Black imagination, but what does it take to actually free our imagination? What type of work does one need to do what type of self-analysis do we even need to have? Like, I mean that question when I asked people. I was in Texas just last week, and I said, stop for a second and think about what a Black future looks like for you. And I asked people, who was in that? Who's in that? I asked them, when Martin Luther King said, I had a dream. I don't know the answer to this. None of us will, but was he dreaming about trans women and boys and girls holding hands on the mountaintop? Was he thinking about wheelchair-bound, disabled bodies? Was he thinking about the intersex? Now, I want to believe he was. But I also know that all of us have these weights, these sort of restrictions, and often these restrictions come because we are situated in the world and move in social locations that are sometimes harmful for us, that keeps us from imagining or seeing or empathizing or living into or being clear about the world as it relates to somebody else's standpoint. And that to me is like the work. And I'll end here. Like, when we did this ride, we thought we were organizing the most profound collective. Like, we're like, this shit's gonna be different. There will be no Bayard Rustin 2.0, no Diane Nash 2.0 from the door. We're like, there will be no misogyny, no, we're going through all this stuff. And only after did a trans sister said first to us, first, I want you to know how much courage it took me to get here, like to actually be part of this ride. Because I typically don't do even intraracial community events like this because I experience the most violence from y'all. Second, It's like, wow, I felt safe here. Thank you. There was no trans leadership, no trans person working with you to help you imagine this. Let's listen to that. So even this thing we thought was radical, a sort of collective, a sort of a movement from the center of the margins to the edges, was limited by our own standpoint, our own cisgender standpoint, which is to say, one can't imagine in isolation. One must dream, and I think this has to happen in community. That's why you can't be a willy-nilly organizer, a willy-nilly leader. I won't know what I'm missing unless I'm in community with those who might otherwise be missing from my vision, who can tell me that shit.
All right. What a gift. What a gift. We're going to do the same thing we did with Dr. West. We're going to take a picture with Brother Darnell.